If you're enjoying this story of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier. Your support helps us bring these historical adventures to life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Clearwater Creek, a frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. The year was 1873, and the settlement had grown from a handful of wooden shacks into a bustling community of nearly 300 souls. Wooden sidewalks creaked under the weight of boots and petticoats as townsfolk went about their daily business. Miss Eleanor Hartford stepped carefully down the steps of the one-room schoolhouse, her dark blue dress rustling softly in the gentle breeze. At 26, she had been teaching the children of Clearwater Creek for 3 years, having arrived from Boston with nothing but determination and a trunk full of books. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her green eyes sparkled with the kind of intelligence that made some of the more traditional townspeople uncomfortable. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, painted white with green shutters that Eleanor had insisted upon painting herself. A small bell tower crowned the building, and the sound of that bell had become as familiar to the residents as the whistle of the noon train. Inside, rough-hewn desks arranged in neat rows faced a blackboard where Eleanor had written the day's arithmetic lesson in her careful script. But this particular morning felt different. There was tension in the air, thick as the dust that swirled around the horses tied to the hitching posts outside Murphy's General Store. Groups of men gathered in hushed conversations, their voices carrying an edge that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with unease. She had noticed it building for days, this strange undercurrent of suspicion and fear that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sheriff Ben Hawkins emerged from his office, his badge catching the sunlight as he walked with purposeful strides toward the schoolhouse. His weathered face bore the kind of lines that came from years of dealing with frontier justice, and his hand rested unconsciously on the grip of his Colt revolver. Behind him walked Mayor Cornelius Blackwood, a portly man whose expensive suit seemed out of place in the dusty street. Eleanor watched their approach with growing apprehension. She had been expecting this moment, dreading it, but knowing it would come. The accusations had started as whispers in the general store, idle gossip among the women as they selected fabric and discussed the weather. But whispers had a way of growing into roars in small towns, especially when fear took hold of people's hearts and minds. 3 days earlier, old Henrik Johansson had been found dead in his cabin, his body discovered by his neighbor when he failed to appear for their usual morning coffee. The doctor had proclaimed it a heart attack, natural causes for a man of 72 who had worked hard all his life. But Henrik had been one of the few people in town who had spoken out against the growing sentiment to drive away the nearby Lakota tribe. The Lakota had been peaceful neighbors for years, trading furs and beaded goods for supplies and maintaining a respectful distance from the town. Their leader, Chief Standing Bear, was known as a man of honor who kept his word and sought harmony between his people and the white settlers. But recent events elsewhere in the territory had stirred up old fears and prejudices. Eleanor had made the mistake of defending the Lakota when discussions turned heated at the town meetings. She had spoken of their kindness, their intelligence, and their right to the land they had called home for generations. Her words had fallen on increasingly hostile ears, and now Henrik's death had provided the spark that ignorance and fear needed to ignite into something dangerous. Sheriff Hawkins stopped in front of the schoolhouse, his spurs jingling softly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes, usually kind when he greeted Eleanor, now held a coldness that made her blood run cold. Mayor Blackwood stood beside him, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool morning air, his small eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and the gathering crowd. "Miss Hartford," Sheriff Hawkins said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used when conducting official business. "I'm afraid I need to ask you to come with me. There are some serious accusations that need to be addressed, and the town council has voted to hold a hearing." His words were carefully measured, but Eleanor could hear the reluctance in his voice. The accusations, as Eleanor had feared, centered on her supposed collaboration with the Lakota tribe. Someone had claimed to see her meeting secretly with members of the tribe near the river that bordered the town. Another witness swore they had seen her passing documents to a young Lakota brave. The most damning accusation came from Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, the banker's wife, who claimed Eleanor had been heard speaking Lakota words to her students. Eleanor's heart sank as she realized how her innocent actions had been twisted into something sinister. She had indeed met with some Lakota women near the river, but only to learn about their traditional medicines when several of her students had fallen ill with fever. The documents were nothing more than drawings and poems her students had made, which she had shared to show the Lakota children's artistic abilities. As for speaking Lakota words, she had learned a few basic phrases to better communicate with the 3 Lakota children who attended her school. The town hall was packed with residents, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, fear, and barely contained anger. Oil lamps flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize the dark mood that had settled over the gathering. The air was thick with the smell of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies, and Eleanor could feel the weight of hostile stares as she was led to a chair at the front of the room. Mayor Blackwood called the meeting to order, his voice shaking slightly as he read the charges against Eleanor. Collaboration with hostile Indians, treason against the United States government, and corruption of the youth through anti-American teachings. Each accusation felt like a physical blow, and Eleanor struggled to maintain her composure as witness after witness stood to testify against her. Mrs. Whitmore was the most vocal accuser, her shrill voice carrying across the packed room as she described Eleanor's suspicious behavior and unnatural sympathy for the savage tribes. She spoke of Eleanor's defense of the Lakota at town meetings, her insistence on treating the Indian children the same as the white children in her classroom, and her refusal to support the growing movement to drive the tribe away from the area. Eleanor was finally given the chance to defend herself, and she stood on trembling legs to address the crowd. Her voice was steady despite her fear as she explained her actions, her belief in treating all people with dignity and respect, and her conviction that education should be available to every child, regardless of their heritage. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears, and the crowd's mood grew uglier with each passing moment. The vote was swift and merciless, guilty on all charges. The punishment, as decreed by the hastily formed tribunal, was death by hanging at dawn. The sentence sent a shock through even some of Eleanor's accusers, but the momentum of fear and hatred had grown too strong to be stopped by reason or mercy. Eleanor was led away to a small cell behind the sheriff's office, her hands shaking as the iron bars clanged shut behind her. That night, as Eleanor sat on the rough wooden cot in her cell, she could hear the sounds of construction outside. The townspeople were building a gallows in the center of Main Street, the hammer blows echoing through the darkness like a funeral drum. She had written letters to her family in Boston, knowing they would likely never be sent, and had prayed for forgiveness for any real wrongs she might have committed in her efforts to help others. Sheriff Hawkins brought her a simple meal of bread and water, his face troubled as he set the tray on the small table in her cell. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Miss Hartford," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "There are some of us who know this isn't right, but the fever has taken hold, and there's no reasoning with them now." His words offered little comfort, but Eleanor appreciated the kindness in his voice. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Eleanor could hear the crowd gathering outside. Voices rose and fell in excited conversation, and she could smell the smoke from cooking fires as vendors prepared to sell food to the spectators. The thought that her death had become a form of entertainment filled her with a sadness deeper than her fear. This was not the America she had believed in, not the frontier community she had hoped to help build. Sheriff Hawkins appeared at her cell door, his face pale and drawn. Behind him stood two deputies, their expressions reflecting their discomfort with the task ahead. "It's time, Miss Hartford," the sheriff said softly, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cell door. Eleanor rose from her cot with as much dignity as she could muster, smoothing her dress and checking that her hair was still neatly arranged. The walk to the gallows felt both endless and far too short. The crowd parted before them, some faces showing satisfaction, others reflecting uncertainty or even shame. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, focusing on the mountains in the distance where she knew the Lakota tribe made their home. She had always found peace in those purple peaks, and she drew what strength she could from their unchanging presence. The gallows stood in the center of Main Street, its fresh lumber pale against the weathered buildings that surrounded it. A noose hung from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Mayor Blackwood stood nearby with a black hood in his hands, while the town preacher clutched his Bible and mumbled prayers under his breath. The crowd pressed closer, their faces eager for the spectacle about to unfold. Eleanor climbed the wooden steps with steady feet, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar from years of teaching their children, others belonging to people she had considered friends. The silence that fell over the crowd was broken only by the creaking of the gallows and the distant sound of a hawk calling somewhere high above. Just as Mayor Blackwood stepped forward with the hood, a sound unlike anything the townspeople had ever heard began to rise from the surrounding hills. It started as a low drumming, rhythmic and powerful, growing steadily louder as it echoed off the buildings and rolled down the main street like thunder. The crowd turned as one toward the sound, their faces reflecting confusion and growing alarm as the drumming was joined by voices raised in what could only be a war chant. Over the ridge to the east came a sight that made the crowd gasp and step back in terror. 50 Lakota warriors rode toward the town, their horses moving in perfect formation as they descended the hillside. They were painted for battle, their faces and bodies decorated with symbols of war and protection. Feathers streamed from their hair, and their weapons glinted in the morning sunlight as they rode with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. At their head rode Chief Standing Bear, a man whose presence commanded respect even from his enemies. He was tall and proud, his weather-beaten face marked by years of leading his people through times of both peace and conflict. His war bonnet was magnificent, each feather representing an act of courage or a victory in battle. His horse, a magnificent pinto stallion, pranced and snorted as if it too understood the gravity of the moment. The warriors came to a halt just outside the town, their horses forming a semicircle that seemed to encompass the entire main street. The drumming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound that the sound of a baby crying somewhere in the crowd seemed unnaturally loud. Chief Standing Bear urged his horse forward, moving slowly and deliberately until he reached the base of the gallows platform. His dark eyes met Eleanor's, and she saw in them a mixture of sadness, determination, and something that might have been gratitude. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent crowd, his English accented but precise. "The woman who stands on this platform of death is known to my people. She has shown kindness to our children, respect for our ways, and courage in defending what is right when others chose hatred and fear." Mayor Blackwood found his voice, though it came out as little more than a squeak. "Chief Standing Bear, this is a matter of white man's justice. This woman has been found guilty of collaborating with your people against the interests of our town. You have no authority here." His words were brave, but his trembling hands and pale face revealed his terror at the sight of the armed warriors surrounding them. Chief Standing Bear's expression did not change, but there was steel in his voice when he responded. When winter came 3 years ago, and the sickness took many of our children, this woman came to our camp with medicine and knowledge. She asked for nothing in return, though my people offered her gifts of gratitude. When the white children in her school spoke cruel words about my people, she taught them of understanding and respect. The crowd stirred uneasily as the chief continued his account of Eleanor's kindness. Some of the townspeople remembered that harsh winter when disease had swept through both the town and the Lakota camp. They recalled hearing that someone had helped the Indians, though they had never known it was their schoolteacher who had risked her own health to tend to sick children regardless of their race. Last summer, Chief Standing Bear continued, when the traders from the east tried to cheat my people with watered whiskey and broken promises, this woman warned us of their deception. She could have remained silent and let my people suffer, but her heart would not allow such dishonesty to prosper. Her actions saved my tribe from great hardship and showed us that not all white people were our enemies. Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward, his hand still resting on his gun, but his posture less threatening than before. Chief, we appreciate what you're telling us, but the law is the law. This woman was found guilty by a jury of her peers, and the sentence must be carried out. His words lacked conviction, and Eleanor could see the doubt growing in his eyes as he listened to the chief's testimony. Chief Standing Bear slowly dismounted from his horse, his movements graceful despite his age. He walked to the base of the gallows and looked up at Eleanor, then turned to address the crowd with words that would echo through the town's history for generations to come. You speak of law and justice, but what law condemns a woman for showing mercy to children? What justice punishes kindness and rewards hatred? The chief reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something that glinted in the morning sunlight. It was a small silver locket tarnished with age and wear. He held it up for all to see, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that silenced even the most hostile members of the crowd. This belonged to my daughter, Morning Star, who died in the sickness 3 years ago. Before she passed to the spirit world, she gave this to the white teacher who had stayed by her bedside for 3 days and nights. Eleanor gasped as she recognized the locket. She remembered little Morning Star, a bright-eyed girl of 8 who had succumbed to the fever, despite Eleanor's best efforts to save her. The child had pressed the locket into Eleanor's hands with her dying breath, insisting that the teacher keep it as a token of gratitude. Eleanor had treasured it ever since, wearing it hidden beneath her dress as a reminder of the bond that could exist between peoples if fear and prejudice were set aside. Morning Star told me that the white teacher sang to her in the darkness, held her hand when the pain was too great to bear, and promised that her spirit would find peace in the next world. This woman you seek to kill showed my daughter more love in her final hours than some children receive in a lifetime. How can you speak of justice when you would murder the angel who comforted my dying child? Udri. The crowd had grown completely silent, and Eleanor could see tears on many faces as the full weight of Chief Standing Bear's words sank in. Mrs. Whitmore, her chief accuser, had covered her face with her hands and was weeping openly. Even Mayor Blackwood seemed shaken, his usual bluster replaced by uncertainty and shame. The morning breeze stirred the dust at their feet, and somewhere in the distance a church bell began to toll. Chief Standing Bear turned back to Eleanor, his weathered face softening with emotion. "Teacher," he said, using the English word with careful pronunciation, "my people have not forgotten your kindness. We have not forgotten how you treated our children as your own, how you defended our right to exist in peace, how you showed us that there can be brotherhood between our peoples. Today, we have come to repay that debt of honor." The chief raised his hand, and instantly his warriors began to move. But instead of attacking, they dismounted from their horses and began to form a protective circle around the gallows. Their weapons remained sheathed, but their presence sent a clear message to anyone who might consider proceeding with the execution. Chief Standing Bear's voice rang out clear and strong across the silent street. "This woman will not die today. She has earned the protection of the Lakota people through her deeds of compassion and courage. Any who would harm her must first pass through us, and we are prepared to give our lives to honor the debt we owe her. This is not a threat of war, but a promise of protection for one who has shown herself to be a friend to all peoples." Sheriff Hawkins looked around at the crowd, then at the ring of Lakota warriors, then up at Eleanor, standing on the gallows platform. The weight of leadership pressed down on him as he realized that his next decision could determine whether the day ended in bloodshed or reconciliation. He had known Eleanor for 3 years, had seen her dedication to her students, had witnessed her kindness to all members of the community, regardless of their station in life. Slowly, the sheriff climbed the steps to the gallows platform. The crowd held its breath as he approached Eleanor, his hand moving not to the noose around her neck, but to the knots that bound her wrists. With deliberate movements, he untied the ropes and helped her step back from the trapdoor that would have ended her life. His voice carried clearly across the silent street as he spoke. "By the authority vested in me as sheriff of this county, I hereby stay this execution, pending a review of the evidence and testimony presented here today. It appears that justice may have been clouded by fear and misunderstanding, and it is my duty to ensure that the law is applied fairly and with full knowledge of the facts." His words were formal, but Eleanor could hear the relief in his voice. The crowd began to murmur and shift, some voices raised in protest, while others expressed support for the sheriff's decision. Mayor Blackwood started to object, but his words were cut short by a voice from the crowd. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the town physician, stepped forward and addressed the gathering with the authority of his position and the respect he had earned over years of service. "I've listened to Chief Standing Bear's testimony, and I remember that winter 3 years ago when the fever took so many lives. I was overwhelmed, unable to tend to all the sick, and I heard rumors that someone was helping at the Indian camp. If Miss Hartford risked her own life to tend to sick children regardless of their race, then she demonstrated the highest ideals of Christian charity and medical ethics." The doctor's words seemed to break a dam of suppressed conscience in the crowd. One by one, other voices began to speak up. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, admitted that Eleanor had helped his son with his reading when the boy was struggling in school. Mrs. Sarah Collins revealed that Eleanor had quietly provided food and clothing to poor families during the harsh winters, never seeking recognition or thanks for her generosity. As more testimonies emerged, a different picture of Eleanor Hartford began to form in the minds of the townspeople. Instead of a dangerous collaborator, they began to see a woman whose compassion knew no boundaries, whose dedication to helping others had sometimes put her at odds with the prejudices and fears that plagued their community. The mob mentality that had driven them to the edge of murder began to crack and crumble. Chief Standing Bear watched this transformation with the patience of a man who had lived through many conflicts and learned to recognize the moment when hearts begin to change. He approached Sheriff Hawkins and extended his hand in a gesture of respect and reconciliation. The sheriff, after a moment's hesitation, grasped the chief's hand firmly, and the two men stood together as symbols of the understanding that could exist between their peoples. "There has been too much fear between us," Chief Standing Bear said, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowd. "Fear makes men do things they would not do in times of peace and understanding. Today, let us choose a different path. Let us honor the teacher who showed us that kindness knows no boundaries of race or tribe. Let us learn from her example and build a future where our children can live in harmony." Eleanor, still shaken by her brush with death, found her voice at last. She looked out over the crowd of people she had served for 3 years, seeing their faces with new eyes. Some still showed hostility, but many reflected shame, uncertainty, and a growing recognition of the injustice they had nearly committed. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I forgive you all," she said simply, her words carrying clearly in the morning air. Fear makes us do terrible things, but it also shows us who we truly want to be when we see how far we've strayed from our better nature. I've never asked for anything more than the chance to teach your children and help build a community where everyone can live with dignity and respect. If you'll have me, I'd like to continue that work." The transformation in the crowd was remarkable to witness. The bloodthirsty mob that had gathered to watch an execution began to disperse, replaced by individuals grappling with their own consciences and the recognition of their near participation in a grave injustice. Some approached Eleanor to offer personal apologies, while others simply slipped away, unable to face the magnitude of what they had almost done. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor's chief accuser, approached the platform with tears streaming down her face. Her voice was barely audible as she spoke, her words heavy with remorse and shame. "Miss Hartford, I don't know what came over me. The fear, the rumors. I let them poison my heart against you when I should have remembered all the good you've done for our community. Can you ever forgive a foolish old woman who nearly cost you your life?" Eleanor climbed down from the gallows platform and embraced Mrs. Whitmore, her own tears flowing freely as the two women wept together. "There's nothing to forgive," Eleanor whispered. "We all have moments when fear overwhelms our better judgment. What matters is that we recognize those moments and choose to do better. Your courage in speaking up now shows the kind of person you truly are." Chief Standing Bear gathered his warriors, preparing to return to their camp now that their mission was accomplished. But before departing, he approached Eleanor one final time. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a beautiful beaded necklace, its intricate patterns telling the story of friendship between peoples. As he placed it around Eleanor's neck, his words carried the weight of prophecy. "Teacher, you have shown my people that there are those among the white settlers who judge others by their actions rather than their appearance. This necklace was made by the women of our tribe as a gift of gratitude. Wear it as a symbol of the bond between our peoples, and know that you will always have a place of honor among the Lakota nation. Your courage today will be remembered in our stories for generations to come." As the Lakota warriors rode back toward the hills, their departure was watched by a town forever changed by the events of that morning. The gallows, which had been built in haste and hatred, was quietly dismantled over the following days. In its place, the townspeople eventually erected a small garden where children of all backgrounds could play together, a living memorial to the lesson they had learned about the dangers of prejudice and the power of compassion. Eleanor returned to her schoolhouse, but her role in the community had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a teacher, but a symbol of the courage required to stand up for what is right, even when faced with overwhelming opposition. Her classroom became a place where children learned not just reading and arithmetic, but lessons about tolerance, understanding, and the importance of judging others by their character rather than their heritage. The story of that day spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who had witnessed the remarkable scene of a Lakota chief riding to save a white schoolteacher from an unjust execution. It became a tale that challenged the prevailing prejudices of the time and offered hope that different peoples could coexist in mutual respect and understanding. Years later, when Eleanor finally returned to Boston to care for her aging parents, the entire town turned out to bid her farewell. Chief Standing Bear and several of his people rode in to participate in the ceremony, their presence a testament to the lasting friendship that had grown from that terrible morning when hatred had nearly triumphed over justice. The bond forged in that moment of crisis had grown into a lasting peace between the town and the tribe. Eleanor's legacy lived on in the students she had taught, both white and Lakota, who carried her lessons of tolerance and compassion into their adult lives. The school she had served was renamed the Hartford Academy in her honor, and her portrait hung in the main hallway as a reminder to future generations of the courage required to stand against injustice and the healing power of forgiveness. The silver locket that Chief Standing Bear's daughter had given to Eleanor became a cherished family heirloom, passed down through generations as a symbol of the bonds that can form between peoples when fear gives way to understanding. And in the hills above Clearwater Creek, the Lakota people continued to tell the story of the brave teacher who had risked everything to help their children, and of the day when justice prevailed over hatred through the courage of those who refused to let fear rule their hearts. What do you think was the most powerful moment in this story? Was it when Chief Standing Bear revealed the silver locket and told the story of his daughter Morning Star, or when Eleanor forgave the very people who had tried to execute her? Share your thoughts in the comments below about which scene moved you the most, and why you think Eleanor's story of compassion and forgiveness continues to resonate with us today.